Okay, so welcome to this Quali Days session for CM form configuration. Many of you probably already know me. You've been in a couple of my sessions, including the one right before this, but I am Colleen Bigelow. I'm the director of the student CS team. So I'll be moderator and host for this. So we'll be watching chat and the Q&A and answering any of your questions. But this session is kind of an overview of the FormBot, which is our form configurator. And so for those of you who have maybe attended our pre-conference session on Monday, we did quite a big deep dive into FormBot then. But so there will be some repeat topics in this session, but Ashley does dive into a couple of other things that we didn't get a chance to dive into on Monday. Please note that upon entry, you are muted, and we do have the chat and the Q&A feature enabled for this session. We do ask that you use the Q&A section to ask your questions. It allows us to do threading and tracking questions a little bit more easily than in the chat. But feel free to comment in the chat and to send us some feedback, encouragement. It's always great as presenters to hear that we're doing a good job. And so both Hannah and I are on the phone and we are on the call, and we will be monitoring both the chat and the Q&A if any questions come up. This session will be recorded and posted on Socio, that platform that you use to view the schedule and sign up for the sessions. It'll be made available usually after the entire user conference has ended. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Ashley Pendergrass, who is a customer success manager for the student team.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I think I've met most of you. My name is Ashley Pendergrass. I am a customer success manager, like Colleen mentioned. My background is in higher education. So I've worked at institutions, small and large, and have been kind of in the curriculum world for a little over a year now, and really enjoying it. So thanks for joining. Today, we're going to talk about CM form configuration. It's one of the first things that we do in implementation because the forms really drive the data structure within Kuali. They're going to drive your workflow potentially. And really, they're going to kind of be the crux of all the information that you're collecting from a curriculum development standpoint or curriculum process approval process standpoint. There are 5 main content types. We touched on this on Monday, but just to reiterate those, it's courses, programs, specializations. Specializations are going to be things that are maybe a child record of a program. So you can think of like emphases or maybe a minor, things like that that are going to be nested under your parent program. And then experiences, which are typically non-standard curricula is the way we think about it. So maybe a study abroad program or potentially a course outline, something like that. And then policies. And policies are available to display in the catalog. We have about 50 gadgets available to use throughout your form configuration. We call our tool a FormBot. I'm not sure of its origins, but essentially that's just our nickname for what FormBot can do or what the form configuration tool can do. To access FormBot, you're going to go to System Settings, Config Settings, and then from there it's structured by content type. And one thing that's important to remember is that in order to access these config settings, you have to have that feature flag enabled that allows admins to access the configuration settings for FormBot. That can be turned on by a Kuali admin, such as myself, Colleen, or you can always contact support as well. So a big feature, an important thing to note about FormBot is you can only have one user in FormBot at a time for a particular content type. So if I'm in courses and Colleen's in courses, we're going to boot each other out. It'll pop up and give you a message that you need to either return to system settings or reload. It kind of works similarly to a lot of other software functionality you might see out there. where essentially one of you is going to get booted out. Zoom kind of works the same way. We experienced that earlier this week. So just keep that in mind if you are in there making some changes to, say, your labels or something like that. The form bot itself displays as a series of columns and rows. So everything is going to be kind of proportional to the number of fields that you put within form bot. And we'll take a look at this here in a minute, but it's kind of important to have that contextual view in terms of how the data can be displayed within the form bot. So admins, when you have that feature flag turned on, admins can update labels, descriptive text, and help text. And this is something where if we go in and create the gadget and give it one name, you can come back and update it to something that makes more sense. The descriptive text will allow you to kind of have smaller configurable text below the label. And then the help text is quite configurable. You can add in HTML links, you can add in bullets, numbered lists, all these different kinds of things like that. Question from Jamie. Would it ever be possible to use the same functionality restricting user access to one at a time in FormBot to CM proposals? It would be really handy to have this working alongside the sharing functionality. So I think, if I understand the question correctly, like, so I'm creating or working on a draft proposal or even a proposal that's under review, and I only want one user to be updating that at a time. That is something that we could consider. It's definitely, I think, been submitted as an enhancement request before. I'm not sure that it's on our roadmap at this time, but that's a good thought, especially as we're looking at some of the commenting functionality that's come out as well. Keep the questions coming. I would like this session to be as interactive as possible. So another thing to know about changes is that they're saved automatically. And this is true within FormBot itself. It's also true when you're updating a proposal. We do have the ability to use save buttons if that's important to your user community, but by default, we recommend using the save automatically. You know, that's pretty standard functionality with emails and Google Docs and things like that these days. Okay, so looking a little bit more at what capabilities are stored within FormBot. We have two types of panels, a proposal panel and an admin panel. And the difference between these two really is a proposal panel is designed to be used when you are creating a new course, for example, or creating a new curriculum record, or you're making changes to an existing one. So it's only going to show on those drafts or those proposals that are under review. An admin panel is only going to show for those users that are in an admin role. Proposal panels will show for everyone. Anyone that can view the proposal can view that proposal panel. Panels are just a big container, more or less, for the fields that are stored within it. So you can have multiple gadgets to a panel. There's no limit there. And you can really design them any way that you like. Gadgets. So I mentioned earlier, we have about 50 gadgets available for use. It's important to note that not all the gadgets can drive the certain pieces of functionality. So not all gadgets can drive progressive disclosure, workflow, or be rendered in the catalog. And one of the things that we do as a CSM is really consult with you early on in implementation. And if you're making changes to your form for that matter, about what you're looking to use that data for, how you want the field to be used within CM, whether it needs to drive workflow, that sort of thing. Looks like we have another question. Okay, do any gadget types prohibit a readable report from being produced? Or alternatively, should we be favoring certain gadget types in the spirit of wanting to report on the info? That's a good question. I think you're asking more or less if all the gadget types are going to display in a report. And they should, the only ones that I think we may need to take a look at would be outcomes and potentially any inheritance gadgets. That's something you'd want to work with your CSM on and just make sure that those fields are displaying the way you would expect. So I guess in short, then yes, you want to consider that as part of your implementation. So some common gadgets, checkboxes. Checkboxes are really popular. They can drive workflow. Essentially, it allows for multiple selections at one time. So you can think of things like campuses or maybe grading scales or things like along those lines where you're selecting multiple values per course record. Groups. So groups are pretty foundational within CM. We talked a lot about them on Monday, but a group type ahead is going to be used to drive your workflow. It can also be used in progressive disclosure, but really the bread and butter is being used to drive workflow. So if I have a school group and I select the School of Business, based on that group being selected, I'm going to look up which roles and users are associated with that group, and then send the proposal to those folks. So you'll find that group type aheads are used on all of your forms with NCM in order to kind of kick off that approval process. We also have a group multi-select. That is heavily used when you think about things like involved department or kind of notifications. Anytime you're wanting to say these other groups or departments are part of this curriculum. So like a joint program or a cross collaboration in terms of like maybe accounting and statistics, that sort of thing is when a group's multi-select will come in handy. And this can also be picked up in the workflow. Option types. So option types essentially provide your own data set. You can manage those within the system settings as well if you have those permissions. And that will allow you to really have that data set available in any of your forms. So it's a repeatable data set across content types. We have a variety of option types available in terms of the actual gadgets you can use. There's drop downs, radios, checkboxes, etc., that are available and can be lookups to your option type tables. And then type aheads. Type aheads are quite common. It's where you start typing and then it's going to find the result that matches your keyword. We see these used for groups, for options. Really, they can be used for any type of values that you're trying to pull in. And then rich text. Rich text is really popular for any kind of structured content that you're asking the user to complete. So some examples that I've seen are when you're asking them to describe like the resources needed for the program change or the impacts to say the students for that particular change. We support things like bulleted lists, tables. You can make rich text read only. There's really just a lot of functionality that comes with having that toolbar embedded within the text area. Any questions about gadgets while we're talking about them? Okay. All right, validation. So validations are a huge part of submitting a form, any form, right? So I think we're all used to that experience by now. If you don't complete something or you complete it improperly, you're going to get notified or it's going to pop up on the screen and tell you that that's been entered incorrectly. So the validations that we provide are required or not required. So you can make any field within your form required. Regular expressions. So these are supported on text fields. A common use case for this would be like the number field. If you want to say only allow 5 characters in your number field, or you only want it to be comprised of numbers, we could add in that regular expression. For these regular expressions, you can provide the message that they'll receive when that criteria is not met. So that can be customized to meet your needs and your user community. You can also set character limits. Common use case for this would be your SIS only allows 27 characters, for example. You can set that criteria on your course form so that you're not getting a title that's, say, 52 characters. You're kind of preventing the user from entering all that text on the front end. Some other settings that are available, the placeholder. So placeholders are when you have text in the input field that you type over. I would say this is kind of underutilized functionality within CM. It would be helpful to just guide the user in terms of what kind of input you're expecting. And again, that's something that can be set up within the gadget config itself. We have a question for what is SIS? SIS stands for a Student Information System. Some of the common ones that we see are PeopleSoft, Banner, Genzabar, Kuali, that sort of thing. And generally, in implementation, we'll spend some time talking about how Kuali is going to interact with that SIS, not only from potentially an integration standpoint, but from the standpoint of the data that you're already collecting, the data that you need to see, say, for example, in your course schedule. The last one is data settings. So data settings essentially are the ability for you to not clone or copy content over from one proposal to another. So let's say that a justification field might be a good example. You are typing in, your rationale for why you're making this program change. If you don't want that data to stick, then next time someone comes in and makes a program change, you would want to use some of these data settings to wipe out that or not copy over that information that they've input. And this can be really powerful because essentially it can allow you to capture different types of changes on the same record over the years and over the versions. Okay, progressive disclosure. Progressive disclosure is a pretty powerful tool. I would say it's some of the more robust functionality within FormBot. It really allows you to tailor the form and the experience depending on previous selections or input on the form. It's really designed to reduce user error, and it's applicable at both the field and the panel levels. So some common use cases to display data specific to only one group. So a department, a division, a college, et cetera. Let's say we want to have certain fields available only to them. Once I say the group is nursing, for example, I'm going to display these 3 fields. That's an example of progressive disclosure. And all of that logic is being embedded within the gadget for each individual field. If I wanted to specify a change type and display fields based on that selection. So a common example of this would be a lot of schools will have a change type question for a modify action or for the proposing changes. And the reason this is handy is not only for reporting, but maybe potentially for workflow as well. So things like maybe you're just changing the course title. So you would have a change type that reflects that course title, and then maybe a certain field that's displayed based on that change. Another example could be learning outcomes. So how you could essentially display certain learning outcome data based on that change type as well. So we see this as being pretty common and pretty helpful, particularly on the reporting side of the house. It looks like there's another question. Lindy asked, for the data settings, is there any discussions about copying or not copying with either proposed changes or duplicate? Right now, the option is both proposed changes and duplicate. There's something we wouldn't want with a duplicate from our SIS, but should with a proposed change. Okay, that makes sense, that those kind of could be 2 separate use cases. Right now, that's not something we've given consideration to. But I think that that's something that our product team would want to talk to you more about. Good question. Progressive disclosure. So essentially answering different questions depending on the action type. So create, modify, or revise. This is really common. You only want to ask certain questions when it's a new program. A lot of schools will have accrediting bodies that they have to send that new program development information to, or maybe they have specific data that they only have to capture that initial on that initial creation. So things like employment outcomes or market demand or fields along those lines, that you would want to create those fields specific to a create program action so that you're only displaying those on that initial program development. Tables. Tables are another powerful tool within FormBot. Currently, we support dropdowns, text, and date columns. They're editable, so you can add and delete rows on the table. You can also lock rows. So if you know that the table should only be 3 rows by 3 columns, you could lock that in place so that they can't add or make deletions. Oops. They can also be read-only. This is additional functionality that we supported, I want to say sometime last year, but essentially a good use case for this would be you have data that a user or a proposer may need a reference in completion of their form, but you don't necessarily want them editing it. It's not fields that they have that capability or that permission to change. So you can make the fields and the columns read only. And that's something that we're seeing more and more of. Here are 2 examples of a table. So the first is looking at course resources. All of these dropdowns are going to be supported by option types. So that's a data set that you would support and update on your own within the system settings. This is just an example of text fields. So in this case, we're looking at the name of the course resource and the ISBN number. The trash can is always going to appear when you haven't locked rows so that you can add and delete them kind of at your convenience. Another common one that we see is enrollment headcounts or enrollment predictions. This provides you with the ability to enter what you expect enrollment to be year to year. This is pretty common, especially for new programs, to kind of try to predict what you see, what you would expect from an enrollment perspective. Inheritance. Inheritance is something that we really come across some unique use cases for. It allows you to establish a parent-child relationship between 2 content types. And it's most commonly what we're seeing is experiences that are serving as the child record and maybe courses that serve as the parent record. I would say that's probably the most common that we're seeing at the moment. So essentially, you're going to perform a lookup to the parent record after you decide which form you're copying the data from or which form is the parent form. We'll take a look at an example of this. When you're doing that display of the data from the parent record, you have the ability to say whether it's going to be view only. So that what that means is you're purely just viewing that data onto the child record. They can't provide any updates or that data doesn't even actually live with that child record. Copy would mean you're actually taking a copy of those values and moving them over to the child record. So if you run a report, you're going to see that data there in the child record as well. An overwrite would be the last option there, where you're not only are you doing a copy from what the value is on the parent record, but you're also allowing the proposer to go in and update that. So you're kind of in some ways overriding that association that was initially created. This is an example of what inheritance could look like. I'm looking at an experience form where I am inheriting from Art 202, Art of the Tropics. And anytime that you see these grayed out fields, essentially I'm inheriting from the parent program, or I'm sorry, from the parent course. So I had to select the parent course here, and then these just auto-populated based on me creating that association between those fields on the parent record and the child record. Okay, I want to jump to a customer example. We're going to look at Boise State's GEC Foundations form. So essentially they are using experiences for this form. Their process is a little bit, I would say it's kind of a more and more common use case, but their faculty senate or general education committee supervises all of the University Foundation's curriculum, and that's their program of general education courses. So they are responsible for kind of making sure that this foundational curriculum is managed and updated the way it should be, and then all those curriculum changes occur in a streamlined fashion. So certain types of changes to one of these courses have to go through a specific approval process. So things like the creation of a new course, updating the course design, a course redesign where they're making substantial content changes. Maybe it's time spent on university learning outcomes. Things along those lines are going to have to go through this separate process. So in their form, if I were to go to new GEC Foundations, I can select the effective year and term, which is going to drive this record. And then I can select the designation. So for them, for the general education courses, they have a series of designations that the courses will fall under. And this is where I'm doing my lookup to the course. So I'm looking up the parent record in this type ahead. So let's say I'm just going to do early childhood, for example. You see how it automatically populated this data. So it came in with the course credits, which it looks like that's a range from 1 to 4. It's populating the semesters that the course is typically offered. It's populating any prerequisites. So those rules that are built on the course form, it would populate that data here. It looks like there's no course requisites. And then I have some fields that aren't being populated by the inheritance that I can just type in as part of this new record creation. One thing that's important to note is that it's also populating the subject code and number and title, which now are supported as inherited fields. So what that means is that you don't have to retype in the subject code and number and title as part of the record. So it can be displayed on the landing page or in this top banner here. That's going to automatically populate based on the parent record selection. So here I could come in and say, what are the other departments involved in this? So I might say educational technology, and then I might say STEM education. And this is coming from a group multi-select. I'm selecting multiple groups that are going to be involved in this GEC Foundations course. This is going to be a program gadget. So I can come in here and find the educational program that corresponds with this GEC Foundations course. And then here I can designate the frequency and size of the course. This is just a text field. So really I can say anything that the user would like. You know, they do try to offer some text about how many seats will be offered, and you can enter in a range. So let's say 24 seats. And it looks like we have a question. If they do a GEC Can only one proposal be in the workflow at a time, or can someone be submitting a course modification at the same time? So that's a good question. For this particular record, so based on the code is how we're determining the uniqueness of this record. You could only have one proposal in workflow at a time. In the case of GEC though, they are not only going to be submitting this change or this new course through their traditional course approval process, they're also going to be submitting it to GEC as well. So that's where we kind of would want to understand a little bit more how the approval process works in order to determine that flow. Most of the time when you're looking at general education designations, we find that both approval processes have to happen. Sometimes concurrently one has to happen first, sometimes it doesn't really matter what the order is. So that's something to consider as well. And then I can say the faculty structure. So I can say that this is going to be supported by one full-time faculty member. And then here's where I can upload a file. In this case, they're looking for their course design template. That's a huge part of this review process for the Faculty Senate Committee. They also have learning foundations, learning outcomes available. So they can start typing in here and determine which institutional or university learning outcome this course is going to meet. And this is a multi-select, so they could select multiple here. And then just one thing to keep in mind that I think is kind of clever that they've done is that they have used the designation field or kind of reskinned it from their description field so that this now appears on their landing page. So if we were to go here, you notice that the description is looking up to which designation they're supporting. And that, for them, that's more practical or more user-friendly than just having a description of the course. So just keep in mind that in this description field, it has to be a text gadget, but you could have it represent other criteria maybe than what could traditionally be seen as a description. I want to look at one other example that they've put in. I think it's this one. But this is another just good example of how the inheritance has populated and how they have all of the information available. And then it can be submitted through their unique approval process for this GEC Foundations course. And that, I believe, was all I wanted to cover in terms of the FormBot. I did want to mention that as you move forward in either implementation or just your use of CM in general, you'll want to consider the downstream impact of your form configuration decisions. It's kind of true with implementation. You don't know what you don't know, right? And sometimes you get further along and then realize, oh, well, it might make sense to do this as an option type, or, you know what, we really needed this data point for accreditation. We at Kuali can always support you in kind of making changes to your forms or including some of those processes down the road, but it's a good idea if you are in implementation to try to think of all of those needs at the onset. So things like accreditation, maybe you want to capture some specific curriculum metrics, anything really that is a data point that maybe lives on a piece of paper right now, or in an email format, or anything that you could use to help streamline your curriculum approval process, is we should consider storing in Kuali. Questions, what questions do we have? No questions? Would you build gen ed as a specialization? You could. The challenge would would be that generally specializations are nested under programs. So your general education specialization would have to have a parent program. We have seen some schools build general education requirements as a separate program. And the nice thing about that is that then they can be used in rules and they display nicely in the catalog. So that's something to consider because it not only does it kind of display nicely in those formats, but it also gives you that approval control that you may be looking for in terms of managing which courses are part of gen eds. Okay. It looks like there's a question about the gadget overview. Yes, so that is the most up to date. And I believe we also have another Excel file that we can send with you as well, or it might be somewhere in Zendesk that has a list of them in a little bit more detail. So we'll find the link for that. Or maybe Mike just sent it. He's on top of things. It looks like Terry had a question. If you make a change to a field to rich text, what would happen to the data in previous records? So that's a really good question and actually something that comes up quite a lot. If you change, say, a text area to a rich text, there aren't any implications. However, if you were to go the other way around and change rich text back to a text area, you're gonna, in your data structure, you'll have that HTML formatting that comes with a rich text, that gadget. So as long as you're going from regular text like text area or text to a rich text, you shouldn't have any issues and we can reuse that same API key. Okay, since we don't have a draft form in CM like we do in Build, would we make massive changes in staging or sandbox before we move them to production? There are so many changes since we first implemented that we want to use. This is a great question. Absolutely. We would certainly want you to make all of those changes in either sandbox or staging. Really, from a Kuali perspective, we don't have a preference on which environment you use. It may involve some data migration depending on the gadget types and those changes that you're making. And we certainly have supported those efforts in the past to kind of move your data structures around or to streamline the form. A good example would be like if you were just storing credits in a text box and now you want to use our credits gadget that is supported in rules, we could help you move that data over to the credits gadget so that now you're taking advantage of the other functionality that comes with using that standard gadget going forward. Okay, feel free to post in the community any other questions that come up, or you can always reach out to your CSM in terms of looking at changes or having questions about what that process may look like. And yeah, we really appreciate your feedback. If you could give us some feedback on this session, that would be great. It's in Socio and you can rate it accordingly. I appreciate everyone joining. Thanks, guys.